Snow fell the way memories do, without asking permission, settling softly over everything that once believed it could be warm again. It moved through the pine valley in long quiet breaths, whitening the animal paths, sealing the river's edges, softening the scars left by wagons and boots and older griefs. At the far bend of the valley, where the land rose into a low shoulder of stone and timber, a single cabin stood holding its ground. Smoke lifted from its chimney in a thin, unsure line, as if even the fire inside questioned its right to remain. The man who lived there had learned long ago not to challenge winter. He worked with it, listened to it, spoke to it as one speaks to an elder who has already decided your fate. His name was Cinametic Black Elk, born of Cherokee blood and shaped by years that had taken more than they ever gave back. He stood outside the cabin now, boots half buried in snow, axe resting against his shoulder, breath fogging the air in slow deliberate clouds. His hair, once black as river stone, was streaked with gray and tied low behind his neck. His face carried the stillness of someone who had outlived the need to explain himself. He chopped wood with steady patience, each strike clean, purposeful, practiced by necessity rather than strength. This was how he greeted the morning, how he reminded his hands and heart that they still belonged to the living world. Around him the forest listened. Trees creaked softly under the weight of snow. Somewhere far off, a crow called once, then went quiet as if reconsidering the effort. Cinametic paused between swings and rested his forehead briefly against the axe handle. The cold bit through leather and wool, sharp and honest. It was a pain he trusted. He had come to this place years earlier, riding north and west until even the maps gave up on naming things. The land reminded him of home without being it, and that was close enough. Here no one asked about the old wars, or the uniform he once wore for men who never learned his language. No one asked about the nights when gunfire echoed in his dreams, or why he woke with his hands clenched as if still holding something that had already been taken. Here the snow erased footprints quickly, and silence felt less like punishment. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, its warmth carefully rationed. Cinametic stepped in, shook the snow from his coat, and laid the fresh wood by the hearth. The room smelled of smoke, pine sap, and iron. Everything in the cabin had been built by his hands or carried on his back. A rough table. 2 chairs, though he used only one. A narrow bed pressed against the wall beneath a small window glazed with frost. Above it hung a single object he had never unpacked, a beaded medicine pouch that once belonged to his mother. He touched it briefly each morning, not in prayer exactly, but acknowledgement. He poured water into a kettle and set it over the fire. The quiet pressed in, thick and familiar. Many men feared this kind of stillness. Cinametic had learned to live inside it, though he would not have called it peace. Peace implied rest. This was endurance. He had chosen solitude after learning how easily closeness could be broken, how quickly promises turned brittle in the cold. He had watched friends build families only to lose them to fever, to whiskey, to the restless pull of the frontier. He told himself he was spared that pain. Yet some nights, when the fire burned low, the emptiness beside him felt louder than any battlefield. He ate sparingly, chewing dried venison and hard bread, listening to the wind begin to rise. Winter storms came fast in these mountains, announced only by a sudden tightening of the air, a restlessness in the trees. By afternoon the sky had dimmed to a dull iron gray, snow thickening until the valley seemed to fold inward on itself. Cinametic moved through his chores with quiet urgency, checking the shutters, reinforcing the door, stacking more wood close at hand. He had learned to prepare before fear arrived. Fear, once invited, stayed too long. As dusk crept across the land, he stepped outside again. The world had narrowed to falling white and the dark shapes of trees. His breath came slower now, thoughtful. He had spoken earlier to the snow without meaning to, a few words in his own language, carried away before they could become anything dangerous like hope. He told the storm it was welcome to pass through but not to stay. The snow answered only by falling harder. It was then he sensed it. Not a sound exactly, but a disturbance in the rhythm of the valley, as if something had moved where nothing should. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt. Years of scouting had taught him to trust such instincts more than sight. He listened again, longer this time. There, beneath the wind, a muffled step. Then another. Slow. Uneven. He moved toward the edge of the clearing, boots crunching softly. The snowfall blurred distance, turning every shadow into a question. He called out once, not loudly, not threatening. His voice carried calm rather than command. No answer came, only the wind's restless reply. He stood still, allowing his shape to be known, allowing whoever or whatever approached to decide its next move. This land had taught him that panic was a luxury few could afford. A figure emerged from the trees, bent forward, shoulders wrapped in a shawl too thin for the weather. Then another followed, smaller, faltering. Two women barely upright, their outlines ghosted by snow. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, hesitation carved into their posture. Cinametic felt something tighten in his chest, an old reflex he had never fully unlearned. Visitors in winter rarely brought good news. Survival narrowed choices until kindness itself felt dangerous. He studied them carefully. One appeared younger, though hardship had carved lines into her face that age alone could not explain. The other stood slightly behind, her hand braced on the younger woman's arm, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. Their coats were worn, their boots soaked through. They carried no weapons, no animals, no sign of a camp nearby. Only need, raw and unmistakable. For a moment no one spoke. Snow filled the silence, patient and relentless. Cinametic felt the weight of the choice forming before him, the familiar pull toward caution, toward the solitude he had shaped his life around. He had spent years convincing himself that isolation was safer for everyone. Fewer attachments meant fewer graves to remember. He had never taken a wife, never allowed his life to knot itself into another's. He told himself this was wisdom, not fear. The older woman finally stepped forward, her voice low and steady despite the cold gnawing at her. She asked for shelter, nothing more. No pleading, no story offered yet. Just the truth laid bare between strangers. Night was coming. The storm was not done. Cinametic looked past them at the darkening forest, then back to the narrow warmth behind him. He thought of the extra chair he never used, the empty space at his table. He thought of the teachings he carried, of hospitality spoken of not as charity but as balance, a way of keeping the world from tipping too far into cruelty. Still his feet did not move. He met their eyes then, really looked, and saw not threat but endurance, the same worn determination he saw each morning in his own reflection. The conflict rose quietly within him, sharp and unmistakable. To open his door was to invite change, to risk a life he had kept carefully contained. To turn them away was to let winter finish what the world had already begun. Snow gathered on his shoulders as he stood there, the storm listening as closely as the trees. Whatever he chose would echo long after this night passed. At last, he stepped aside and gestured toward the cabin, not with words but with the simple honesty of action. The fire crackled inside, unaware it was about to bear witness to something more dangerous than cold. They crossed the threshold as if stepping out of one life and into another, bringing the storm with them in their hair and on their shoulders. Snow slid from their coats and pooled on the rough wooden floor, melting into dark, uneven shapes. The fire answered their arrival with a low pop, sparks lifting briefly before settling again, and the cabin filled with the sharp scent of cold carried indoors. Cinametic closed the door behind them, shutting out the wind, and the sudden quiet felt almost intimate, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. The younger woman stood stiffly near the door, her gloved hands clenched together as though she feared they might vanish if she let go. Her name was Aloan Hartley, though she did not offer it yet. She was the kind of woman whose strength had been shaped by necessity rather than pride. Her face bore the pale tight look of someone who had learned to endure hunger and disappointment without complaint. Dark hair escaped its braid and clung damply to her cheeks, and her eyes moved carefully about the room, measuring safety the way a wounded animal does, ready to bolt if the air shifted the wrong way. The older woman, Ruth Calder, removed her shawl with slow deliberate movements. Age had bowed her slightly, but there was nothing fragile in her bearing. Her gaze was steady, assessing not the cabin but the man who owned it. She had learned long ago that places mattered less than the hearts that ruled them. Lines framed her mouth, etched there by years of speaking sense to men who did not wish to hear it. She carried grief the way others carried tools, close at hand, used often, never set down. They did not rush toward the fire. They waited. That alone told Cinametic more than any story could have. He gestured toward the hearth, and only then did they move, the stiffness in their limbs betraying how close they had come to freezing on their feet. Aloan sank onto a low stool, exhaling as though her body had finally received permission to stop pretending. Ruth remained standing a moment longer, her posture protective, before easing herself onto the second chair that had gone unused for so many winters. Cinametic poured water and set more wood on the fire. He did not ask questions yet. In his experience, answers arrived when they were ready, and forcing them open only deepened wounds. The silence that followed was thick but not unkind. Outside, the storm continued its steady assault, but inside the cabin the air began to warm, carrying with it the faint relief of survival postponed. Aloan held her hands out toward the flames, fingers trembling despite herself. She watched the fire as if it were something sacred, her lips parted slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, worn thin by cold and long roads. She thanked him, not with effusive gratitude but with the quiet sincerity of someone who knew the weight of the gift she had been given. Shelter was not small in a world that turned its back so easily. Ruth spoke next, her tone firm, grounded. She explained they had been turned away twice already, once by a rancher who claimed no room, and again by a homestead that pretended no one was home though smoke still rose from its chimney. She did not sound bitter. Only tired. The road had taught her that resentment wasted energy better spent on putting one foot ahead of the other. She said they would leave come morning if he wished. They asked for nothing beyond the night. Cinametic nodded, his expression unreadable. He offered them food, simple fare, and watched as Aloan hesitated before accepting, pride flickering briefly before hunger won. Ruth took her portion without ceremony, dividing it carefully, ensuring the younger woman ate first. This small act revealed more than any confession. Ruth had spent years guarding what remained, measuring risk with a practiced eye, carrying responsibility that had never been hers by choice. As they ate, the firelight softened the lines of their faces. Aloan's gaze drifted occasionally to the window, as if expecting someone to appear out of the storm and claim her. Nothing came. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, weighted with unspoken histories pressing gently against one another. When Cinametic finally asked where they were headed, the answer came haltingly. Aloan spoke of a town to the south, one that promised work for widows if they proved useful enough. She did not say how many promises she had already followed only to find them hollow. Ruth added that the journey had taken longer than planned. Winter had closed in faster than expected, and their supplies had not kept pace. Each word carried the quiet understanding that planning meant little when the world decided otherwise. Aloan's story unfolded slowly, revealed in fragments rather than confession. She spoke of a husband who had chased opportunity until it disappeared over the horizon with another woman's laughter echoing behind him. She had waited longer than she should have, believing loyalty might summon him back. It never did. When she finally left the house they had built together, she carried only what she could hold and the certainty that waiting was no longer living. Ruth's loss had come differently, swift and merciless. Fever during a cattle drive. One week a man who laughed too loudly, the next a shallow grave marked with stones. She had learned then how thin the line was between partnership and solitude. She took Aloan in not out of charity but recognition. Survival was easier when shared, even if it demanded compromise. Cinametic listened, his face still, his thoughts stirring. Their stories did not shock him. He had seen variations of them etched across the frontier, carried in the eyes of women who learned too young that permanence was a lie men liked to sell. Yet something about the way Aloan spoke, careful not to accuse, and the way Ruth guarded her words, stirred an unease he could not name. He recognized in them a familiar endurance, the kind that grew where hope had been bruised but not entirely killed. Night settled fully outside, pressing its weight against the cabin walls. The storm showed no sign of breaking. Cinametic prepared bedding near the fire, giving up his own bed without comment. Aloan protested weakly, but he silenced her with a look that allowed no argument. Ruth watched this exchange closely, filing it away not as proof of kindness but of character. Men could perform generosity easily when watched. True measure came later when comfort cost something. As they lay down, the fire casting long shadows across the room, sleep did not come easily. Aloan stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a place that was not yet hers. She felt the strange ache of safety, how it loosened muscles long held tight, and with it came fear. Safe places had ended before. She did not yet trust this one. Cinametic sat awake by the fire, knife resting idle in his hands. He told himself this was temporary. Morning would come and with it separation. Still, as he listened to their breathing even out, he felt the walls of his carefully kept solitude shift just slightly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent to human decisions. Inside, 3 lives hovered on the edge of change, none of them yet willing to speak its name. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through a veil of snow that softened the light and blurred the edges of the world. The storm had eased, though winter still held the valley firmly in its grip. Smoke rose again from the chimney, steadier now, and inside the cabin the fire had been coaxed back to life. Aloan woke first, the unfamiliar ceiling drawing a sharp breath from her chest before memory returned. She lay still, listening, counting the sounds. Wood shifting in the fire. The low murmur of water heating. Another breath nearby, slower and deeper. Safety announced itself not with comfort, but with the absence of fear. Ruth was already awake, seated near the hearth, mending a tear in her shawl with practiced hands. She looked up and met Eloan's eyes, giving a small nod that carried reassurance rather than instruction. Across the room, Cinametic moved quietly, his back to them, preparing what little breakfast he could offer. There was no awkwardness in the space, no need for conversation to justify their presence. The silence felt earned, shaped overnight into something less threatening. They stayed longer than planned. No one named the decision outright. The storm lingered, roads vanished beneath fresh drifts, and each morning brought another reason to wait. Cinametic never asked how long they intended to remain. He spoke instead of weather patterns, of passes that would remain closed until spring. Ruth understood the offering beneath the words. Time given without demand. Days found their rhythm. Eloan learned the shape of the cabin, where the floor creaked, where light pooled in the afternoon. She helped with chores without being asked, her movements careful, respectful of a place not her own. Ruth took charge of the cooking, improving the simple meals with knowledge carried from other kitchens, other lives. Cinametic watched these changes with quiet attention, noting how the space adjusted around them, how the cabin breathed differently now. What grew between them did so without announcement. No grand gestures marked the passing days, only small moments stitched together. A shared laugh over burnt bread. Ruth's stories told by firelight, neither embellished nor softened. Eloan's quiet humming while she worked, a sound that settled into the timber like something always meant to be there. Cinametic listened more than he spoke, offering guidance when needed, respect always. Eloan carried her past carefully, but it surfaced in fragments. She spoke one evening of the man who had come after her husband left, a man with clean hands and loud promises. He had seen her need and mistaken it for invitation. When she would not bend herself to his expectations, he turned cold, calling her ungrateful, broken. She spoke of that moment not with anger, but with a sadness that surprised her. Cinametic listened, his jaw tightening slightly. He said nothing of his own past then, but something in his eyes darkened, a recognition passing through him. Ruth watched these exchanges closely. She had lived long enough to know when attention tipped toward something dangerous. She trusted Cinametic's restraint, but trust was not blindness. One evening as Eloan slept, Ruth spoke plainly. She told him she would not see the younger woman harmed again, not by false kindness or half-promises. Cinametic met her gaze without flinching. He told her he had never been married, never claimed anyone. He said he understood the weight of responsibility and the cost of failing it. Ruth believed him, not because of his words, but because of the way he did not rush to convince her. As weeks passed, winter loosened its grip just enough to suggest the possibility of change. Snow still lay deep, but the air softened, carrying hints of thaw. Eloan found herself lingering near Cinametic more often, drawn not by desire but by the calm he carried. He did not look at her as something to be fixed or claimed. He saw her work, her endurance, her quiet humor. In his presence she did not feel measured against her past. One afternoon they walked together to the edge of the clearing. The forest stood heavy with snow, branches bowed but unbroken. Cinametic spoke of his childhood, of lessons learned from elders who believed the land remembered how it was treated. He spoke of serving men who never learned to listen, of returning with nothing but silence. Eloan listened, feeling the weight of what was not said settle between them. She realized then that his solitude was not emptiness, but protection. That night, as the fire burned low, Eloan admitted something she had never spoken aloud. She said she had stopped believing kindness could last. Not because she was cynical, but because hope had proven too expensive. Cinametic considered her words carefully. He told her he had chosen to live alone because he feared being the cause of someone else's suffering. He had seen what happened when men promised more than they could give. Their confessions did not demand resolution. They rested between them, fragile and respected. Ruth sensed the shift before either of them named it. She saw how Eloan's shoulders eased, how laughter returned to her voice. She also saw the caution in Cinametic's movements, the way he kept a careful distance even as connection deepened. One evening, Ruth stepped outside alone, standing beneath a sky bright with stars. She whispered a blessing into the cold air, not asking for miracles, only balance. As winter waned, the question they had avoided pressed closer. Roads would open. Choices would return. Eloan felt the pull of the future like a tightening string. She did not know what she wanted yet, only that leaving felt heavier than she expected. Cinametic sensed this too, the approaching moment when silence would no longer suffice. On the last night before the first thaw, a wind rose, rattling the shutters. Inside, the three of them sat close to the fire. Ruth spoke of spring, of towns rebuilding, of lives continuing whether one was ready or not. Eloan stared into the flames, seeing not endings but crossroads. Tyanita watched them both, understanding that what had grown here could not remain untouched by choice. When sleep came, it did not bring answers. Only the certainty that something rare had taken root, fragile as the first green beneath snow. Morning would demand truth. And none of them knew yet how much it would cost to speak it. The thaw came the way truth often does, quietly at first, then all at once. Snow loosened its hold on the valley, dripping from branches in steady rhythms that sounded like time restarting. The river cracked its white shell and began to move again, dark water pushing forward with purpose. Inside the cabin, the air felt different, lighter, as though the walls themselves sensed that waiting was no longer enough. Eloan stood at the window watching the slow retreat of winter. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman changed by stillness. The fear that once lived permanently in her chest had softened, replaced by something far more dangerous. What? Not for possession or rescue, but for the fragile possibility of staying where she was seen without explanation. She turned as Tyanita entered, his boots wet with melt, his expression unreadable. He spoke first, his voice calm but weighted. The pass would open within days. Travel would become possible again. The words settled between them like an offering and a warning both. Eloan nodded, her throat tightening. Ruth listened from her chair, hands folded, already understanding that the moment she had anticipated had finally arrived. That evening the sky darkened unexpectedly. Clouds rolled in thick and low, carrying a storm that winter seemed unwilling to surrender. Wind battered the cabin, rattling the door with sudden fury. Tyanita moved swiftly, reinforcing the shutters, checking the roof. This storm was different, aggressive, as if the season itself resisted being left behind. Eloan helped where she could, her movements steady despite the rising tension. Ruth prepared lanterns, her face composed, though her eyes flicked often toward the door. When a crack echoed from the mountainside, deep and thunderous, Tyanita froze. He recognized the sound immediately. A snow shelf breaking free, rushing downward with unstoppable force. The cabin lay just within its path. He shouted for them to move, his calm breaking into urgency. They grabbed what they could and fled into the night, snow and debris roaring behind them like a living thing. They reached higher ground moments before the valley floor vanished beneath a wave of white and broken timber. The world roared, then fell silent again, stunned by its own violence. They stood there together, breath ragged, watching as the place that had sheltered them disappeared. Eloan's knees buckled, shock stealing her strength. Tyanita caught her without hesitation, holding her upright as the reality of loss settled in. Ruth closed her eyes, whispering a prayer not of sorrow but of gratitude. They were alive. Everything else could be rebuilt. Eloan clutched Tyanita's coat, tears freezing on her lashes. In that moment, the fear of wanting dissolved into certainty. Safety was not a place. It was a person who stayed when the ground gave way. They made camp beneath the pines, fire coaxed from damp wood through stubborn persistence. Dawn found them huddled together, exhaustion stripping away the last of their defenses. Tyanita looked at Eloan as if seeing her fully for the first time, not as a guest or a burden, but as a woman who had stood her ground when the world shifted. He spoke then, his voice low, steady, carrying truth without ornament. He said he had lived believing solitude was virtue, that love demanded strength he did not possess. He said he had been wrong. Eloan answered with equal honesty. She said she was done running toward promises and away from fear. She said she did not need saving, only choosing. Ruth watched them, her expression softening into something like peace. She had carried Eloan to this threshold, and now it was time to step back. When the storm passed fully and spring asserted its claim, they built again. Not the same cabin but something sturdier, closer to the ridge. Ruth decided to continue on when the roads cleared, her path leading toward kin who still waited. She left without sorrow, only pride, pressing Eloan's hands and blessing Tyanita with a nod that carried hard-earned trust. As Ruth's figure disappeared down the pass, Eloan and Tyanita stood side by side, the valley below transformed. Snow retreated, revealing earth ready to begin again. Tyanita spoke the words that had once defined his loneliness, not as lament but as marvel. He said he never had a wife because he had not yet learned what it meant to be worthy of one. Eloan answered by taking his hand, her grip firm, unafraid. The land listened then, truly listened, and let them stay.